En los últimos días se reunió en la Ciudad de México un llamado grupo del G20, el grupo de 20 personalidades en el mundo de la política, la academia, exfuncionarios, algunos periodistas. Y una de las personas que vinieron a México es el profesor Francis Fukuyama, que es un autor polémico que ha desatado pasiones, envidias, odios, admiración, con varios libros. Uno de ellos fue El fin de la historia, y otro también que fue un bestseller mundial que se llama Trust. Professor Fukuyama, it's a pleasure that you can be with us. We live in a broken society, and you are a bestseller author on trust. You know Mexico very well. So you know what is the diagnosis, what is the problem we are facing today. And based on your experience and your knowledge of Mexico, is there any way, or do you foresee any possible solution to put together again this broken society in Mexico?
Well, first of all, I would contest the idea that Mexico is a broken society. I know that anyone that lives in a country that's got big problems with narco-trafficking and growth.
It's very much based on perceptions in Mexico.
It's based on perceptions, and I think sometimes it helps to step back a little bit and to look in a longer-term historical perspective where Mexico is today, where it was, 20, 30 years ago. And I think there's been, a very big transformation. Mexico is a genuine democracy, a competitive democracy, a much more open society. It's modernized in very many ways.
But you would argue that the social fabric is cemented, is not broken.
Well,
is that
no,
what you're
I
saying?
think there's a big lack of trust in the political parties and the government because there's still high levels of corruption and insider dealing and that sort of thing. But those are all problems, I think, that are recognized, and I think they can be fixed over time.
How would it be fixed in building trust?
Well, it's rational to distrust institutions that are not trustworthy. Let me just give you an illustration. Mexican presidential elections were notoriously corrupt for many years, and as a result of the last, the Salinas election, they established IFE. IFE, is actually, I think, an amazing institution, and it means that in many respects, presidential elections in Mexico are cleaner, or at least as clean as in the United States. Now, I know that the last election was contested by Lopez Obrador, but I think that was actually a very unfortunate and wrong charge. And so now, you actually do have a trustworthy means of selecting a president. You're not going to have these big
massive fraud.
Massive fraud, and so that's the way you get to trust. You have to build institutions, and you have to do it institution by institution, and it takes a long time. In the United States, we went through, I think, this period in the late 1890s up through the New Deal, and this was a 40-year period in which, one institution at a time had to be made trustworthy so that people actually thought that the government was their friend rather than their enemy.
Do you believe that somehow the conservative parties in Mexico and the world would have already get to their limit, and then will have to come back, just as it happened to the left wing or to the liberals at some point? After
It's a very curious thing is going on right now, because we've had this financial crisis that's led to a big recession in the United States and other parts of the world. And this should be leading to the rise of a kind of progressive or left-wing populism. And instead what you see both in the United States and in Europe is the rise of right-wing populist parties. They're very angry at elites. They think that the elites have betrayed them. And it's a very dangerous thing. And I think part of the reason that this is happening is that the left parties have not put forward a plausible progressive agenda that people trust and will buy into. And I think that really is, a lot of what needs to be done right now.
Do you think that something like that applies also to Mexico, to underdeveloped world in which we have even more poor people and more, social basis for the left
See,
wing.
I think in Latin America in general and in Mexico as well, what you need are responsible center-left and center-right parties. Now, Brazil and Chile have gone through this evolution, and so in both of those cases, you've now got left-wing parties that understand you have to have economic growth, you have to have reliance on markets, but they still have a social agenda that cares for poor people and, you know, provides social services and deals with the problem of inequality. In Mexico, I think the party of the left isn't quite there yet. It hasn't reconciled itself, you know, to the market and to globalization, and I think that's an evolution that still needs to...
In such a context, Professor, why do you think that Mexico doesn't grow?
Well, I think there's a pretty straightforward answer, that the economy has still not been liberated from the control of, you know, small number of monopolies or oligopolies. And so, you know, mobile phone prices are so much more expensive in Mexico than they ought to be. I mean, you can go through the list in energy. That's an old problem in Mexico, but, you know, there hasn't been investment in that sector. Electricity, you know, one thing after another. The economy, in a sense, is strangled by a small number of players that you know, don't permit competition. And I think Mexico could do a lot of good for its long-term growth if you know, if that changed.
Professor Fukuyama, during most of the 90s, I think you represent the most important figure in conservative thinking in the U.S. And when you wrote such an important book as The End of History, what would you change today if you have to re-edit that book? Or from that point to today, what would you expect to happen, and what's a surprise for you in the current events?
Well, actually, I have rewritten the book. In the middle of writing this 2-volume study called The Origins of Political Order. So I published the first volume last year in English. And I think if you look between The End of History and my current work, the single thing that probably has changed is a greater appreciation on my part for how difficult it is to establish real institutions. You know, you can establish a state, but to establish a state that is not based on patronage, on giving out jobs to party workers, you know, that has actually a bureaucracy that can deliver health care, education, security in a, you know, in a universal manner.
Do you have a specific position for specific policies like immigration, for example, which traditionally used to be like, well, conservative thought or policies used to be quite tough?
No, well, I was never tough on immigration. I think it is a total travesty that we have not had a comprehensive immigration reform. I think it's so obvious what needs to be done. I was actually on a study group at the Brookings Institution, and we issued a report, and I think, you know, very clearly you need to, well, first of all, there needs to be a system of employer-based, you know, enforcement of the existing laws, but there also needs to be a path to legalize the, 10, 12 million immigrants that are not, don't have legal status. And the right, you know, just refuses to even consider this possibility. But the idea that somehow they're going to continue in this status indefinitely, I think is a terrible burden on the country, because, you know, their children, they have no security, their children, you know, have trouble getting services, and so forth. And so this deal really has been there for quite a few years. They tried to do it under the Bush administration. Obama, I think, has been scared to take this up because he's had other priorities with health care and financial reform. But I think if he wins a second term, this is an obvious thing that needs to happen.
In that sense, well, that sounds very different to what the Tea Party is proposing. So I think you are quite critical to that type of thinking. So how do you explain that they have been going that far in the American society? Why the Tea Party can be that popular?
I think that it's partly a reaction to the financial crisis and the general sense of insecurity now You know, we were growing very rapidly in 2006, 2007, and all of a sudden you get the biggest setback since the Great Depression. And I think the Tea Party represents a kind of misdirected populism. And so they have this idea that there are these elites out there that have done these really bad things, but they've directed their anger not against the, you know, Goldman Sachs and Citicorp and so forth, but actually against the Obama administration that was actually trying to, in a sense, protect them from, you know, those financial, you know, that financial sector. But, you know, it's a very American tradition to really mistrust the government.
So it's a type of populism that it's not actually accusing the right institutions.
You mentioned Chile and Brazil as two success cases. Both countries went into the democracy from a dictatorship, which is not the case in Mexico. Even we had an authoritarian regime. It was very liberal, to say it in one way. Do you think there is something we miss? What the society, the left, the right in those countries were eager to walk together. Do we, that kind of incentive is what apparently we are lacking of?
Yeah, that might be part of it. You know, in a sense, the PRI had been part of the problem, and you know, but you know, in a sense, I think Mexico is really a different case because,
well,
in many respects,
they say South America it's a different continent from Mexico and North America.
You know, I think that the problem with the PRI government, it's not so much that it was a dictatorship, but you know, the whole way of governing was through the co-optation of social groups and the use of government resources to mobilize political support, and that's really not how a modern government needs to operate.
But we're living that reality.
You're living that reality.
And it's just about to come back.
Yeah.
No, actually, the other parties learn from that.
The other parties learn from that.
They are doing that. I mean, it's like we are even in a worse situation than we were before.
They are not as efficient as they used to be.
Well, okay, so I'm actually writing right now the second volume of this book. The United States was actually in this exact same situation at the end of the 19th century.
So you would say, for you Mexicans, you have to say, that's enough.
Well, no, I think what I would say is Mexicans have to realize that this is not an inevitable form of government and that, you know, you need a different kind of politics.
You sound very optimistic about Mexico, Professor.
That's good. That's something really good.
Are you?
Well, again, you know, it's seeing the glass half empty or half full. I mean, as I said, in the United States, this kind of a struggle, you know, didn't occur quickly. It really took 2 generations, you know, to get to a cleaner form of politics. And so I think that, you know, it's disappointing that you haven't made as much progress as you like, but it's, you know, it's only the beginning.
Professor, thank you very much to be with us.
Okay.
We have been here for a long time about the world crisis, austerity, on growth, and there's coming the G20 meeting in Mexico. Did you expect that the G20 group will be receptive to the number of proposals that the 21st Century Council has been putting on the agenda? Do you expect something to come out of it?
Well, first, I think to go back to what the G20 is. The G20 unites really today the leading countries of the world. And the world has changed, and that is reflected by the G20. The G20 today...
It used to be the G7.
It used
not
to be the
anymore.
G7 and then the G8. And that reflects 2 things. It reflects that the actors who are the actors that make the world function and are relevant in the world have grown and have moved from the Western countries that used to really be the engine of world growth to countries such as Mexico, which is now part of what is leading the world forward.
The emerging economies, you would say, the South.
Emerging economies, many of them have emerged, in essence. So to put back, to take your question, there's no question that the G20, because it reunites all these 20 countries and because it meets every year, is really the forum for global governance. And governance matters because governance can change at the global level, but then at the citizen level, the fate of countries and of citizens. But what the G20 now has is that because it's inclusive of all these different countries, as you say, emerging markets, it also reflects the fact that emerging markets and emerging economies and countries such as Mexico have contributed tremendously to the growth on the planet. So even though the G20 is there to be effective and has to deal with crises, we have to remember that the fact that the G20 came from the G8 is actually a very positive sign that from 8 countries that in theory mattered around the world, now there are more than 20, meaning that you've had overall global growth. And I think that one of the key elements that the G20 needs to maintain is the continuity of this global spirit in terms of trade. So one of the key things that the G20 has always accepted and promoted, in which we as the Institute, and having met with President Calderon and with some of your leading candidates for presidency, one of the things that we obviously are advocating is to keep the trade flows as open as possible, because the world and every country really benefit.
It's not as easy. That's what I was wondering, if you are optimistic beyond trade.
Well, above trade, to your point, is global growth. And the G20, which was headed by the French president, because he was the head of the G20 a year ago, and we met with him at the time, the G20 put on its agenda as #1 global and inclusive global growth, which we think continues to be, as you're inferring, the #1 objective. So if you don't have growth, you know, in a world of 7 billion people, you're not going to be able to serve that, you know, the planet. So growth has to be #1. By having the 20 leading countries of the world meeting and discussing the issue which you just put on the table, the question marks about dissonance between countries and growth agendas between Europe, the US, parts of Asia, South America, by having this forum of leaders coming together, at least you facilitate and you increase the chances of positive responses and of policy measures that will help growth. In the case of Mexico, President Calderon is advocating green growth, and I think it has 2 very important and good elements which we support as a group. #1, green growth by definition is, you know, has the idea of taking capital and investments to areas that will obviously be beneficial, but will also address issues of climate and pollution. It's better to make an investment in the subway system than in another highway, if you take, you know, 2 and compare them. And the other advantage of green growth is that you can do this at the local level. You don't have to just rely on supranational or states themselves, but you can go to the local level of cities, municipalities, and states to help in that direction. For example, in California, which is one of many states in the US, California has adopted a policy of green growth, which was advocated by two governors in a row, Governor Schwarzenegger and now Governor Brown. We delivered actually 2 letters from those 2 governors to your president, President Calderon. And so at the local level, investment in green growth can be made. And it's very important to be able to translate some of the directives of the G20 to make sure that they are actually applied at the national level, but then also at the local level. And we think that that is actually a very valuable and innovation on the part of the G20.
Now Nicholas, I think at the end of the event during the press conference, some of us were a little bit surprised because it looks like you give a very positive vision of Mexico, very optimistic conclusions. I think if you concentrate just in one piece of advice of what Mexico should do, what could you say is the most important thing in the for the next presidency? And if you try to make a balance of strengths and weaknesses of the country, what would you say are?
Well, I think that Mexico has enormous strengths. As you said, it has a wonderful, it's a beautiful and diverse country with a lot of natural resources. It has also the advantage of a large and young population. And you have activities in almost every industry. That's the good news. I would say that the area which could be improved, and I think would benefit a lot if you liberalize certain industries and really increase competitiveness at the local level in many different industries.
Why would that be with such a disequilibrium, the agenda setting? And the second one would be, why the Institute is not making particular recommendations on adding other topics to the agenda? I mean, of course, you have strong recommendations on things that are going to be already under discussions, but then I would be expecting for an institute like yours to, for example, talk or suggest them to talk about the cooperation, international cooperation for organized crime or migration, and other topics that relate or talk much more about the links between the developed and the emergent economies.
Well, I think 2 very good questions. I think, in my mind, at least 2 fairly simple answers. The world is truly a global world. You're no longer in a world where you benefit certain countries, let's say the advanced countries versus the less advanced countries. I would think the opposite. What we've seen, and the reason why the G8 has become the G20, is that the advanced countries have actually opened up and have done so much trade with the emerging nations that the emerging nations have, in essence, graduated to become stakeholders at the global level. So I would say that any policy that benefits almost any member in the G20 will benefit the others. So you're not at all in an environment where you're going to benefit one side versus the others. And anything that relates to investments, anything that relates to global coordination in terms of finances and flows of funds and trade, I think is beneficial to all G20.
Stability, I guess, macroeconomic stability.
All of it will benefit every member of the G20, including Mexico. So I think it very much, and this is, the G20 seems probably quite abstract to a lot of people because they, if you when you wake up in the morning, you don't interact with the G20. You interact with hopefully the son and maybe children or family, but you don't interact with the G20. So it's fairly abstract. But the truth is that G20 really is something that if it adopts policies that benefit one member, it will, in general, benefit not only the other 19, but in truth, way beyond. It's really an influencer on a global basis. In terms of our institute's recommendations, you make a very good point, and I'll give you sort of two answers. One is that countries around the world have already difficulty coordinating a few different things. And I would think almost the opposite has potentially happened with the G20, which you have what we would call sort of mission creep, that you have more and more items that are added to the agenda, all good items. So they're, the ones that you mentioned are key. And you could almost say, well, why not this, why not that? So you could end up with 30 items. The key is to fulfill the initial goals that the prior G20s have adopted. And I think some of these goals are so key and so important that if they get adopted and is follows through with those, that's really concentrating on those is almost more important than adding new ones. And one of the things that we as a group are recommending is that the G20, which is structured in a way where you have a roving presidency, you have a presidency every year, which is good in the sense that it keeps the G20 very much in focus and it keeps everybody engaged. But because the seat moves from country and from continent to continent, you have different different priorities, different political environments that come with a new leadership.
Do you think, or can you reach international institutions as the IMF or the World Bank? Or during the conference you mentioned that part of the change of we are seeing in the world is in a way we can witness that in that type of institutions. G20 can impact as well, UN, or
oh, no question.
Is that the idea?
The G20 meetings actually are not just 20. A few others are invited, the head of the IMF, the head of the World Bank. So you've got actually these people at the table. And no question that over time, for example, the IMF, World Bank, should probably be more representative of what the G20 is, which is more participation on the part of so-called emerging economies.
Well,
so I think that shift will happen.
That's going to be something to see. Nicholas, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.